The night my family erased me, I was holding a piece of reclaimed pine, its grain cutting like veins under my palms. My name is Beatrice Clara, and 2 years ago my parents gave my brother $180,000 for his second house and called me a failure. I didn't argue, I walked away. What began as exile became creation. Out here by Mirror Lake, I learned that silence can build more than money ever could. But when the family I left behind came to claim what I built, I learned something even more dangerous. Peace looks a lot like defiance when you've been told to stay small. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. At the farmhouse table, the varnish was nicked, and the hydrangeas were arranged like a performance. We were celebrating my brother's next move, though nobody said celebration. They said opportunity, momentum, legacy. My father cleared his throat, slid a white envelope across to Caleb, and angled the flap toward him as if dealing a card he'd been saving for the big hand. For the house, Dad said. 180,000. Close fast. The second house, Mom added, proud and soft. A portfolio is security. The word second hung in the steam rising off the casserole. Caleb pinched the envelope's corner, his eyes bright in that money light I'd seen since we were kids. I reached for water and felt the glass sweat. The envelope sat like a wedding invitation to a ceremony I hadn't been told existed. "Isn't it wonderful?" Mom asked, turning her church smile on me. "Your brother's on a roll. He's the one who'll carry the family name," Dad said, tender and final, like he was placing something fragile in Caleb's open hands. A floorboard popped. I tried to make my face a place where kindness could live. "It's a big gift," I said. "Investment," Dad corrected. "We invest in winners." When I was 12, I rebuilt Granddad's loose gate latch with a cut nail and a bent washer. The hinge stopped crying and the yard stayed closed. Dad called it cute, then told me not to scratch the truck with my pliers. I kept fixing things because fixed things were quiet, and quiet felt like love when praise didn't show up. He said it to Caleb, but the word winners moved like a blade and found me anyway. Caleb flashed his boyish grin, the same one that used to accompany trades where he took the candy and I kept the wrapper. I had chosen another language. Load spans wind, quiet math. No one applauds until a thing stands. "We're so proud of him," Mom said, slicing neat squares. "And proud of you too, of course." Of course landed like a napkin straightened after guests have gone. I had put myself through engineering at Oregon State, one lab shift at a time, paid off my loans, and taken the job at Summit Design and Build because the work felt like something you could hold. When I'd called home with the offer, Dad's first question was about benefits. His second, still renting. "You're too independent for your own good," he'd joke, a compliment delivered like a caution. In our family, it meant keep proving you don't need us so we can spend our resources where the pictures look better. Now, with the envelope open and Caleb smiling, the joke felt like a trap. I kept my breathing steady because engineering teaches rhythm, find it, and you can survive more than you think. "Where is it?" I asked, giving myself a task. "River Heights," Caleb said. 3 beds, glass wall, football weekends pay the mortgage. It's a smart play. He nodded at Dad. "Family move," Dad said, satisfaction warming his voice. "And me?" I asked before I could rehearse it into something softer. "Where do I fit into family moves?" The room held its breath. Mom dabbed her mouth, buying time. Dad's gaze settled on me the way a level settles on center. "You've always been the self-sufficient one," he said. "Caleb needs help." There it was, the old verdict newly printed. I nodded like he'd explained steel grades. Hydrangea petals looked like paper lies. "I paid off my loans last year," I said. "Not complaint, just anchor. I've been saving for a down payment." "Good for you," Dad said, approving, like I'd taken out the trash. "That independence is why we didn't worry." "Worrying and helping aren't the same," I said, and heard the therapy in it as soon as it left my mouth. "Why make it a competition?" Mom asked. "Your brother had a rough patch. Families step in." I pictured his rough patch, the lease Dad covered cards Mom paid, And my own winters turning the thermostat down and drawing ramps for an elderly client until midnight so his chair would glide instead of lurch. I thought of the nights I traced framing plans on butcher paper at my tiny kitchen table, cooking rice in the same pot I'd had since freshman year, because buying better kept losing to the next certification exam. No one took pictures of that, but the building stood anyway. "I'm not competing," I said. "I'm asking what the plan is for me." Dad lifted his glass and set it down with a ring in the wood. "The plan is, you continue being you. Caleb gets this boost now, because that's how we grow as a family." Caleb tried on an expression I couldn't read. Gratitude, triumph, pity. He tucked the envelope into his jacket like a magician palming a coin. Something small and decisive shifted in me. Granddad built this house. I know the beams by touch. Love lives in the wood, but it wasn't in how we were speaking. I folded my napkin, edges aligned. "Congratulations," I told Caleb. My voice stayed even. I pushed back my chair. "So soon?" Mom asked. "We made cobbler." "Rain check," I said. "Don't be dramatic," Dad snapped as if I were drifting out of tolerance. "We're doing what makes sense. We invest in winners." The word didn't clang. It cracked like ice deciding to be water. I took my coat. At the threshold I paused because some old part of me still waited for rules about how to belong. Caleb started to say my name. I shook my head small enough. Outside, dusk had gone that Oregon blue that makes the world feel like a held breath. Gravel grated under my boots. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need sound to prove I had left. At my car, I looked back once. Through the kitchen window, silhouettes moved. I sat for a beat with my hands on the wheel, listening to the engine's low steadiness, a sound that didn't ask anything of me. The porch light pooled on the gravel like a stage I no longer needed. Somewhere a dog barked and stopped. The quiet held, and I realized I could too. I pulled onto the road. The creek's voice faded. The farmhouse shrank in the mirror until it was only a light with no shapes inside it. "If they won't see my worth," I said into the quiet, "I'll make it impossible to ignore." The highway unspooled into night. I didn't know the plan yet. I knew only this: whatever I built next would not need an audience to stand. I buried myself in work because the rhythm of construction drawings was the only thing that made sense. At Summit, design and build deadlines were the pulse that kept me upright. Steel glass and calculations, clean, unambiguous things that didn't ask for love. The office smelled of toner and coffee grounds, and the hum of the plotter was steadier than any heartbeat in my life. I spent my days drafting footings and my nights reviewing specs for clients who would never know my name. Every invoice I sent out, every detail approved, felt like proof that I existed outside my family's version of success. Still, I carried the dinner in my chest like a bruise under the ribs. I told myself I was fine, that independence was armor, but even armor gets heavy when no one ever offers to carry it. I'd look up from my desk at night to find the office empty, city lights scattered like fragments of something I couldn't quite assemble. Some of my coworkers called me machine girl because I never took breaks. I didn't mind. Machines don't feel disappointment when they're forgotten. When the days grew longer, I took extra freelance projects, retail remodels, porch restorations, odd consulting gigs for contractors who needed someone precise but cheap. I told myself it was for the experience, but really it was for distance. Every new job built a few more inches between me and the people who had called me self-sufficient, like it was a punishment. Sometimes on late nights, I'd drift into a memory of my dad's old workshop, the smell of sawdust oil and the cold bite of metal tools. When I was 14, I had taken apart his broken lawnmower just to see why it wouldn't start. After 3 hours, I got it running again. He didn't even come outside. The next morning, he just said, "You should have left it alone." I was going to buy a new one. That was the moment I understood what I fixed didn't matter if it didn't come from him. Then came the morning the layoff email hit my inbox. The subject line read, "Restructuring Notice." I clicked it twice, thinking it was a mistake. My name was there in the third paragraph, clean and impersonal. The company had lost a major contract. Half the staff was being released. I read it 3 times, the words flattening into static. The same week, my lease renewal notice came with a rent increase. I stared at the 2 documents on my kitchen table and laughed quietly because sometimes the universe doesn't whisper, it yells. When I told my mother, she sighed like I'd spilled milk. "You're resourceful," she said. "You always land on your feet." She didn't ask how I felt, didn't ask if I needed anything. Then she added almost kindly, "Maybe you could help Caleb with his home office until you find something." I thanked her and ended the call before the silence could swallow me whole. That night, I tried to remind myself that losing a job wasn't the end. Engineers rebuild from collapse all the time. But as I packed my desk the next day, I realized it wasn't about work, it was about worth. I'd spent years earning certifications, teaching myself structural software, designing award-nominated buildings, and yet one envelope could erase it all. My father used to say real stability comes from family. I looked at the box of my belongings and thought maybe that's why I never had it. I came home, poured a glass of water, and opened social media out of habit. The first post that appeared was a photo of Caleb standing in front of his new home, white siding, black trim, the envelope's promise turned into walls. My parents were on either side of him, champagne glasses raised. The caption read, "So proud of our son. The next generation of Bennetts keeps rising." The comments were filled with hearts and praise. I stared at the image until the brightness blurred. I could almost hear my father's voice behind the photo. "We invest in winners." The apartment was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum. The more I looked, the smaller I felt, like every mile I'd built from them had led me right back to this screen. Then something in me steadied. I closed the app, deleted every family contact, and sat in the dark until my breathing matched the city outside. I thought of the blueprints I used to draw when I was little, tree houses, with impossible ladders, bridges that crossed clouds. I used to believe that if I drew something well enough, it could become real. Maybe that part of me wasn't wrong. The next morning, I woke before dawn, showered, and drove aimlessly through Portland's industrial district. The streets were still wet from rain. I passed old brick warehouses, half-empty lots, skeletons of half-built condos. Somewhere between the river and the hills, I started to feel the faint pull of direction. It wasn't about finding another job or begging to be seen. It was about building something that didn't require permission. I went home and dug through my savings folder, 2 years of careful budgeting, freelance checks, side projects. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I searched listings for land within driving distance, places forgotten by people who only valued what was finished. That's when I remembered the small lake where Grandma used to take us when we were kids, Mirror Lake. She'd called it her quiet heaven. After she passed, the property had sat unused, half wild. By evening, I'd found the coordinates online, and there it was, one overgrown lot listed under Bennett Family Holdings. My parents hadn't touched it in years. They probably forgot it existed. I zoomed in on the satellite view, a faint outline of a collapsed dock, a narrow dirt road curling like an invitation. I printed the image and taped it to my wall beside my old design sketches. My apartment looked like a war room of one, but it felt right. I was done asking what I was worth to them. I'd find out what I was worth to myself. Outside, the rain returned, soft and constant. I stood by the window watching the streetlights shimmer through the water. Somewhere in that sound, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known since childhood. Not comfort, just clarity. Tomorrow I'd drive to Mirror Lake, not to remember, but to start. If they wouldn't see my value, I'd build something that made their blindness undeniable. And when it stood, when it was real, I'd never have to ask for a seat at their table again. The road to Mirror Lake curved like a question no one wanted answered. Pines pressed close on both sides, branches clawing the sky, and the air smelled of damp soil and rust. When I pulled up to the old gate, the sign was half-fallen letters, faded, "Private property, Bennett family." It felt strange seeing my name there, tied to something they'd forgotten. The lock was rusted through. I lifted it off like it was waiting for me. The lot was worse than I remembered. Waist-high grass, collapsed dock, a sagging shed listing toward the water. But underneath the neglect was a kind of invitation. My grandmother used to sit by this lake in a lawn chair with a straw hat tilted back, calling it her quiet heaven. I could almost hear her laugh in the wind. For a moment, I just stood there, the silence stretching around me, until I felt it settle in my chest. Then I got to work. I cleared the weeds first, cutting through brush until the soil showed again. The ground was uneven, full of roots that snagged the blade, but I kept going. Sweat mixed with pine sap, and the smell reminded me of her kitchen cedar floors and bread rising in the oven. I worked until dusk, sleeping in my car that night, with the window cracked and the sound of frogs singing over the lake. It wasn't comfort, but it was mine. The next morning, I drove into town for supplies. The hardware store was small, run by a woman named Carol, who looked at me like she'd seen a ghost when I told her the property. "That place has been empty near 15 years, she said. "You family used to be," I said. She smiled faintly, wrote me a discount without comment, and told me where to find the landfill for debris. Word travels fast in towns like this. By the second week, people were waving at me from porches, curious about the woman living out of her hatchback and clearing land alone. In the evenings, I'd sit by the water with a notebook sketching rough outlines. Nothing fancy, just lines for a small cabin, one window facing the sunrise. I didn't know if it would ever be real, but drawing it helped me breathe. The sound of pencils on paper was steadier than the thoughts in my head. When I went to the county office to check on the deed, the clerk frowned at her monitor. "This is still under a deceased owner," she said. "No transfer filed. My grandmother's name was still listed in full Martha Bennett." I felt a quiet pulse of something between shock and gratitude. "What happens to untransferred property?" I asked. She shrugged. "If there's no contest, and you can prove relation, you can initiate a transfer. But it'll need to go through a title hearing." That night, under the weak glow of a lantern, I filled out the paperwork by hand. I used the only name I trusted, now my own, and registered a small LLC, Clara Design Works. If the family name was a door they locked behind me, I'd build a new one. For the next few weeks, I lived on coffee canned beans and stubbornness. My hands blistered from hauling debris, my back ached from shoveling. Every morning, I woke to frost on the windshield, and every night I fell asleep to the smell of sawdust. There was something honest about exhaustion that came from creation instead of survival. One afternoon, while I was hauling scrap wood to the road, an older man stopped his truck beside the gate. "You the new owner?" he asked. "Not officially yet," I said. "Working on it." He nodded toward the lake. "My wife and I used to bring our kids here. Glad someone's cleaning it up." He handed me a bag of apples before driving off. The next day, someone else dropped off a thermos of soup. Small gestures, but they carried more warmth than anything my family had offered in years. By the end of the month, I'd cleared enough to see the slope leading to the water. The soil was soft black, alive. When the wind moved through the trees, the reflection rippled like breath. I began marking foundation lines with white chalk, tracing where the walls might rise. Each stroke felt like reclaiming something they'd tried to erase, the right to exist on my own terms. I started sharing small updates online under the tag #rebuild Mirror Lake. Just photos at first, the lake at dawn, a sketch pinned to the trunk of a tree, my gloves beside a pile of boards. My captions were short: "Building what they buried, work louder than words." People began to comment. Strangers, architects, women who wrote about starting over after divorce or layoffs. They saw something in the grit and the mud that made sense to them. Then one night, after a long day pulling nails, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but the area code was home. I answered, and the voice on the other end sliced straight through the calm I'd built. "Beatrice," my father said. "What the hell are you doing on family property?" "I'm restoring it," I said. "You're trespassing," he snapped. "You have no claim there. If you want to play builder, do it somewhere else. Stop embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing who?" I asked. Silence followed, thick, cold. Then he hung up. I sat in my car for a long time, the phone still glowing on the seat. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moon, calm, unbothered. I realized I wasn't shaking from fear anymore, but from adrenaline. For the first time, I wasn't his daughter trying to prove something. I was just a woman standing on her own land, whether he acknowledged it or not. The next morning, I filed the last of the paperwork at the courthouse. I paid the fees with the last of my severance, my hands still raw from work. When the clerk stamped the forms, the sound echoed through the room like a verdict. I walked out into sunlight that felt cleaner than anything I'd known in years. That evening I stood by the water, watching the surface still itself after a gust of wind. My grandmother's reflection would have smiled at me, I thought. The dock was gone, the house only a drawing, but for the first time I felt the quiet she used to talk about, the kind that isn't empty but waiting. Whatever came next, it would start here on this forgotten lot where I was no longer invisible. The ground beneath my boots wasn't family land anymore. It was mine. The first morning I decided to build for real, fog still clung to the lake like breath on glass. My tools lay in the back of my car, cheap but faithful hammer saw, tape measure, spirit level. I set them out on the hood like soldiers ready for orders. The land was quiet except for the distant sound of loons and the crunch of frost beneath my boots. This was no dream. This was work, the kind that demands skin. I started with what I knew: clearing, measuring, marking the foundation. I'd studied enough soil mechanics to recognize that the ground here was solid, high on clay, and packed tight from years of disuse. Perfect for a single-level cabin. My drawings from the notebook became real lines traced in string, the corners squared, the slope planned for runoff. By noon I had blisters on both hands, and the wind carried the smell of wet pine and iron nails. I could almost hear my father's voice saying, "You'll quit before you finish." The thought lit something raw and electric in me. I worked until the moon rose, my breath visible in the beam of my headlamp. By the third week, I had the frame of a floor laid out in salvaged beams from an abandoned barn a mile away. I'd bartered for them with a local farmer, trading design sketches for lumber. It was an even deal, his new fence posts for my raw material. I cut the boards to fit, hammered each nail until the rhythm replaced thought. Pain was temporary, precision was permanent. The day Eli Monroe walked into my life, I was wrestling with a stubborn post that refused to set level. His voice came from behind me, steady and amused. "You're fighting the ground. Try turning the grain toward the slope." I turned, startled, to see a man in his early 30s, tall with the kind of calm that comes from building things by hand. His truck bed was loaded with lumber and a carpenter's square. "Sorry," he said, smiling. "Didn't mean to interrupt. Carol at the hardware store told me about the woman rebuilding the lake lot. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." "I can manage," I said, though I'd been thinking the opposite all morning. He nodded, not offended, then added, "Tell you what, if you ever want a second opinion, I'm working on a deck 2 lots over." He left a business card on my sawhorse before walking off. It read, "Eli Monroe, Carpentry and Design." Later that day, when the post tilted again despite my efforts, I picked up the card. The next morning, Eli showed up with his tool belt slung low and a thermos of coffee. "Figured I'd check if that post surrendered yet," he said. Together we reset it, his hands guiding the angle, his patience unhurried. It took half an hour, but when the beam stood perfectly vertical, we both stepped back and smiled. "Looks like she's listening now," he said. I realized he talked about structures the way I did, like they were alive. From then on, Eli became part of the rhythm. We worked side by side, often in silence, the kind that feels companionable instead of heavy. He showed me tricks: how to notch joints faster, how to brace beams using less wood. I showed him how to calculate load paths with simple triangulation, a skill he called engineer witchcraft. When the first walls went up, we stood beneath them as the wind whistled through the open frame, both grinning like kids. We scavenged materials wherever we could. Reclaimed windows from a church renovation, copper wiring from a demolished diner, roofing sheets that a local hardware store sold cheap because they were dented. Every piece had a history, and together they formed something new. The cabin started to look less like an idea and more like a heartbeat. But the work took its toll. My palms split open, my shoulders ached from lifting beams. Nights were a blur of aching muscles and quiet pride. The few locals who passed by started bringing things: sandwiches, scrap wood, even a generator. It wasn't charity. It was kinship. They saw the fight in me and offered fuel. For the first time in years, I felt part of something that didn't require proving. Eli and I would share coffee on the half-finished porch at sunrise, watching lights spill across the water. He'd tell me about his father, a builder who taught him everything before cancer took him too young. I told him about mine, still alive but buried in pride. "Guess we both inherited tools we didn't ask for," he said once. That line stayed with me. Weeks blurred into months. Every nail I drove was a word in a language I was finally fluent in. By midsummer, the structure had a roof and bones strong enough to stand through storms. Eli wired the solar panels I'd bought with my remaining savings, while I carved shelves from leftover boards. We worked until our hands were raw, until even the wind smelled of sweat and cedar. The lake reflected our progress like a witness. One evening, as I measured the frame for the front door, Eli approached with a folded newspaper. "You made the local feature," he said, handing it over. The headline read, "Woman Revives Forgotten Lake Lot with Sustainable Design." There was a small photo of me standing on a ladder, hair tied back, hammer in hand. My cheeks burned, but my chest felt light. The article was kind, calling the rebuild a testament to perseverance. That night, I posted a thank you on my page, grateful but humble. I didn't know the spark it would ignite. Within days, messages flooded in, requests from small business owners asking if I could help them redesign their old shops, repurpose their spaces. They said my story gave them courage to start again. I didn't have a company, only a name and a few tools, but I said yes. Between projects, Eli and I kept working on the cabin. Each improvement felt like breathing deeper after years of holding my breath, but beneath the progress was a shadow I couldn't ignore. One evening, while packing up, Eli's expression shifted. A contractor friend called, he said quietly. "Your brother's name came up." My stomach tightened. "Caleb." He nodded. "He's filing a quiet title action through your father's attorney. Claims the land belongs to the Bennett family trust." For a long moment, all I heard was the wind sliding through the trees. I'd expected resistance, but not this soon, not this sharp. I looked out over the cabin, the walls, the beams, the months of labor, and felt the old pain flare like heat under the skin. "They can't stand the idea of me building something they didn't give me," I said. Eli placed a hand on the porch rail, firm and steady. "Then make sure they can't take it either." That night, I sat by the lake alone, watching the reflection of the half-finished cabin tremble on the surface. The stars were bright enough to see every imperfection in the wood, every scar on my hands. I wasn't just building a home anymore. I was building proof of worth, of resilience, of independence they couldn't rewrite. The lawsuit would come, and I would be ready. But for now, the hammer, the wood, and the water kept rhythm with my heartbeat, and that was enough to keep going. The summons arrived in a manila envelope folded too neatly to be anything but trouble. It was from the county court, Caleb Bennett versus Clara Design Works. A quiet title action claiming that I, the defendant, had illegally assumed ownership of Bennett family property. Reading the words felt like swallowing nails. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and arrogance. I stood in the half-finished cabin, surrounded by the sound of rain on tin, and felt every memory of family dinner laughter twist into something sour. It wasn't about land, it was about control. I called the courthouse that afternoon, the clerk confirming what I already feared. Caleb's lawyer was the same man who handled my parents' estate documents for decades. They'd turned blood into paperwork again. I hung up before she finished explaining the procedure and stared at the lake until my reflection blurred. I thought about calling Eli, but pride beat me to it. Instead, I spent the night researching legal terms, drafting responses, printing out the deed transfer, and every tax receipt I'd paid since filing for ownership. My grandmother's note, folded and faded, sat at the top of the pile. She'd written, "For be the only one who listens." Her voice reached through the paper, and I clung to it like breath. The courthouse smelled of old paper and colder judgment. Caleb sat at the petitioner's table, immaculate in his tailored suit, the same lazy grin he wore when our parents bailed him out of debt the first time. Our parents sat behind him, eyes sharp, unblinking. My father didn't nod, didn't speak. I represented myself because I couldn't afford counsel, but I refused to let that look like defeat. I wore my work boots, polished my palms raw from sanding the deck the night before. When the judge entered, everyone rose. I didn't look at my family again. Caleb's attorney started with polished venom. The defendant acted with intent to appropriate family assets without consensus or authorization. He described me as a disgruntled daughter, an opportunist leveraging sentiment for personal gain. Each word was designed to shrink me back into their version of myself, emotional, impulsive, undeserving. I stood when it was my turn, heartbeat steady despite the tremor in my voice. Your Honor, I began. The property was neglected for 15 years. The title remained under my grandmother who left, written intent for transfer to me. I filed legally maintained the land, paid all associated fees, and built the structures with my own funds. The attorney objected, saying personal labor didn't constitute ownership. The judge silenced him with a raised hand. You have proof of payment and occupancy. I handed over the receipts and a binder thick with photographs, before and after shots, each dated, showing the transformation from rot to structure. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. But when Caleb took the stand, he played his role well. I just want to preserve family property, he said smoothly. My sister's always been independent. We never thought she'd take something that belonged to all of us. The implication settled in the air like poison gas. My mother dabbed at her eyes, my father's mouth twitched in satisfaction. Then came the part I hadn't prepared for, affidavits signed by both parents, claiming I had no right of claim, that I'd misunderstood my grandmother's intentions. My pulse went hollow. I could feel the ground tilt beneath me. That signature, my father's careful scrawl, was a betrayal deeper than any insult. I stared at it until the ink blurred. The judge called a recess. Outside the courtroom, I stood by a vending machine that whirred like it was choking on dust. I called Eli. He answered on the first ring. They're saying I stole it, I whispered. They signed against me. Breathe, he said. You're still standing in there. That means they haven't won. They have money lawyers, everything I said. He paused. They don't have the truth. You do. That's worth more when you stay calm enough to use it. When the hearing resumed, I spoke less from notes and more from the ache that had followed me my whole life. I told the court how my grandmother brought me to that lake, how she told me stories about trees older than our name. I said I wasn't fighting for inheritance, but for acknowledgement that the land had been abandoned until I chose to care for it. I quoted the old note aloud, voice shaking but clear. For B, the only one who listens. The courtroom went silent. Even Caleb's smirk faltered. The judge didn't rule that day. He said additional review was required. But as I left, I caught my father's eyes for the first time. He looked at me like a problem that had evolved beyond his control. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the courthouse steps slick and shining. I walked to my truck and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel. For the first time in months, the silence inside me wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, crowded with every cruel word I'd swallowed. I wanted to drive until the world disappeared behind me. But then I thought about the cabin, about each board nailed with my hands, each corner squared by my own judgment. If they took the land, they'd never take that. They couldn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, building, cutting, hammering, sanding through the dark. Each strike of the hammer was defiance. By dawn, my muscles screamed, my palms burned, but the frame for the final wall stood solid. The lake reflected the skeleton of the home I'd built, tall and unbroken. Eli arrived at sunrise carrying coffee and quiet strength. You've been up all night, he said. They're going to win, I muttered. He shook his head. Maybe in paper. Not in truth. You've already done what they said you couldn't. You made something out of nothing. You're not fighting for dirt B. You're fighting for the right to decide who you are. I looked at him, exhaustion blurring the edges of the world. And if I lose? He smiled faintly. Then we rebuild again. That's what builders do. Later that day, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. A reporter from the local paper had seen my photos online and wanted to feature the project. A story of rebuilding after family fallout, she wrote. I almost deleted it, but something in me hesitated. Maybe the world needed to see more than their side. Maybe the truth could be louder if I stopped hiding it. I typed back one word, yes. When I hit send, I didn't know that a single interview would carry my story far beyond Mirror Lake. I didn't know it would bring cameras, strangers, and attention my family couldn't control. I only knew that for the first time, I was done letting them narrate my silence. The next storm would come, but this time, I'd be ready to stand in it. The article hit the paper 2 days later, then spread faster than wildfire. Engineer rebuilds family land, alone after being cut off. The photo showed me standing by the half-finished cabin, sunlight on my face, sawdust glittering in the air. It wasn't staged, it was real. By nightfall, my inbox filled with messages from strangers, small business owners, single parents, veterans, people who said they saw themselves in my fight. Donations poured in through a link the journalist had added without asking money for tools, materials, solar panels, things I hadn't dared to budget for. The outpouring felt unreal, but also grounding. For once, people weren't looking down on me, they were looking at me. Within a week, the property transformed into a small construction site. Locals came by to help patch the roof, pour concrete sand beams. Carol from the hardware store organized a volunteer crew. One man brought his teenage son and said quietly, "He needs to see what standing up for yourself looks like." I thanked them all, but inside I carried a knot of dread. My father's silence since the hearing wasn't peace, it was a storm gathering behind the horizon. The court's final decision arrived in the mail that Friday morning. The envelope was thin, the kind that decides futures without ceremony. I tore it open with shaking hands. The court recognizes Clara Design Works as the lawful owner of the property formerly recorded as Bennett Family Holdings. I read it twice, then again, waiting for disbelief to settle into reality. I laughed, a short, startled sound, then cried so hard my knees gave out. The cabin, the land, the life I'd built it, was all mine legally, and finally. Eli found me an hour later sitting on the porch with the letter in my hands. "You won," he said softly. "You really did it." I nodded, unable to speak. He lifted me to my feet and spun me once, both of us laughing through tears. For the first time in years, joy didn't feel borrowed. I didn't know then that victory had already drawn my family to the gate. It started with the sound of tires on gravel, the sharp screech of something that didn't belong to this quiet place. A black SUV rolled into view, sunlight glaring off its hood. Eli's hand tightened on my shoulder. The vehicle stopped just beyond the fence, and I recognized the figures stepping out: my father rigid as a blade, my mother pale behind him, and Caleb in a crisp shirt that looked straight out of an ad. Dad's voice cut through the air before the doors even shut. "You made us look like monsters." I stayed where I was, calm but alert. "You didn't need me for that," I said. He marched closer, boots sinking into the damp earth. "You told the whole world lies about your family. You humiliated us." "I told the truth," I replied. "The part you spent years rewriting." My mother's lip trembled. "We were trying to protect the family name." "No," I said evenly. "You were protecting your reflection." Eli stepped out of the cabin, then wiping his hands on a rag, his presence quiet but solid. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. He just stood beside me, eyes steady on my father. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For once, I wasn't alone in this confrontation. Dad pointed toward the cabin. "You expect me to believe you built this with your bare hands? You couldn't even change a tire when you left home." I smiled faintly. "Looks like I learned." "You did this to spite us," he snapped. "You wanted revenge." "No," I said, my voice soft but clear. "Revenge would mean I still care what you think. I don't." For a moment the air between us stilled. Even Caleb faltered. He looked around at the structure, the beams, the solar panels, the lavender I'd planted by the path. "You really built all this," he murmured. "With help," I said, glancing at Eli, then toward the volunteers still packing up in the distance. People who believed in what I could do, not in what I owed. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We only wanted what's best for you." I shook my head. "No, you wanted what made you look best. There's a difference." My father's jaw flexed. "You're turning your back on blood." "Blood is supposed to mean protection," I said, "not ownership." He stepped closer, face red. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time." "Then stop being embarrassed," I replied. "There's nothing shameful about standing on your own." The sound of voices caught his attention. Neighbors at the edge of the clearing watching quietly, phones in hand. Someone had started recording. My father's expression shifted from anger to panic. He glanced around, realizing this wasn't a private showdown, it was exposure. I didn't move. I just looked at him. The man who'd once told me I was too independent for my own good, now crumbling under the weight of my independence. "You can leave now," I said quietly. "The property's legally mine." The court confirmed it. His eyes flickered. "You wouldn't." "I already did." I handed him a copy of the judgment folded neatly. His fingers shook as he read it. Eli's hand brushed my arm. "Let it go," he murmured. "I already have," I whispered back. My father's shoulders slumped, years of authority collapsing under truth. "Did you really build all this for yourself?" he asked, voice low now, almost human. "Yes," I said, "and for everyone who was told they couldn't." He turned, looking at my mother. Her face was streaked with tears. Caleb stood motionless, eyes darting between us like he couldn't decide who to side with anymore. "Let's go," my father muttered finally. He handed the letter back but didn't meet my eyes. My mother hesitated, her gaze searching mine for something to hold on to. I gave her nothing but silence. She'd already filled enough of it with excuses. When the SUV pulled away, the clearing felt suddenly vast. The sound of the engine faded into the trees, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through pine. I stood there, heart pounding, not with rage, but with release. For the first time, I felt the weight lift. Eli turned to me. "You okay?" I looked at the cabin, glowing gold in the setting sun, the water shimmering beyond it. For the first time, I said completely. That night, when I sat by the fire outside, I replayed the confrontation in my mind, not to relive it, but to seal it. They'd come to reclaim control, but all they'd seen was proof they no longer had any. I didn't need to win an argument. I'd already won a life. The following morning, the online video of the confrontation had spread everywhere, millions of views, headlines calling it "the day the family came back." Strangers called me brave. I didn't feel brave, I just felt free. And freedom, I realized, was the one inheritance they could never take back. When the noise finally faded, when the headlines cooled, and the cameras stopped showing up at the gate, quiet settled over the cabin like snow. It wasn't the kind of silence I'd grown up fearing, the heavy, disappointed quiet of my parents' home, but the kind that hummed with life beneath it. The court had ruled in my favor. The confrontation was over. Yet every morning when I stepped outside, I still half expected to see their SUV return, dust rising from the road. It never did. Instead, the world that had watched me build now began to ask if I could help them build too. Emails came from small towns, from shop owners with peeling paint and cracked counters, from widows who wanted to turn old barns into cafes or homes. They didn't want perfect, they wanted possible. I couldn't do it all, but I didn't want to say no. So I registered a new name with the state, the Lake House Collective, and turned the cabin into a workshop for anyone willing to learn. At first, it was just a handful of people on weekends. A single mother who brought her teenage son to help sand planks, a retired firefighter who said he missed the weight of work, a college student who'd been told she wasn't strong enough for construction. We learned together, spilled coffee on blueprints, shared lunches on the porch. I taught them what I knew: how to read load paths, how to find level, how to rebuild without erasing history. They taught me how community feels when it's real. Soon the cabin didn't feel like mine alone. It breathed with the footsteps of others. The smell of sawdust mixed with laughter, with the smoke from Eli's grill, and the tang of pine after rain. He became my constant companion, not because I needed rescuing, but because he fit into the rhythm I'd made for myself. He was there when the new volunteers arrived, when the first custom table we built sold to a cafe downtown, when the local paper called us a grassroots design studio, changing the meaning of home. It wasn't lost on me that I was doing for strangers what my parents had refused to do for me, invest in their beginnings. The irony didn't sting, it soothed. Every nail we set felt like closing a wound that had bled too long. I never called my parents, never reached out. But one afternoon in late summer, Caleb's name appeared on my phone. For a long moment, I considered letting it ring out, but something in me, curiosity, maybe compassion, made me answer. He didn't start with small talk. "Mom and Dad are selling the house," he said. "Taxes, upkeep, it's too much now. They keep asking why you won't come home." I was silent for a moment, watching sunlight flicker through the trees. "I already am home," I said. He sighed. "They think if you'd just talk to them, Caleb," I interrupted. "Every conversation we ever had started with what they thought and ended with what I felt being wrong. I don't owe them another round of that." He didn't argue. Instead, his voice softened. "They're not the same. Losing everything changed them. So did being treated like I was nothing," I said quietly. "Difference is, I built something out of it." He was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, "I saw the place in person." "It's beautiful, Bea. You did good." "Thanks," I said, meaning it. "You could have done good too, you know." "Yeah," he murmured. "Maybe it's not too late." When we hung up, I didn't feel anger, just a strange peace, like closure without words. I realized forgiveness didn't have to be announced. It could live quietly inside the choice not to hate anymore. Eli found me sitting on the porch later, sketching a new project. "You look lighter," he said. "I talked to Caleb," I replied. "He said they're selling everything. Do you want to go back? Say goodbye." I looked at him then, out toward the lake where ripples glimmered in the afternoon light. "I already said it, just not to them." He smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small wooden box. "Then maybe it's time for something new." Inside was a simple ring carved from the first beam we lifted together. No diamond, no metal, just polished walnut with a single silver inlay. "Beatrice Clara," he said softly. "Will you keep building with me?" I laughed, tears stinging my eyes. "Only if we draw the blueprints together." That night, the community gathered for the Lake House Collective's first open event. The cabin glowed with lanterns, the porch crowded with people holding cups of cider and plates of food. I stood at the edge of the dock looking back at the life I'd built, a real one grounded in effort instead of approval. Eli raised his glass and called out, "To building something that lasts." Everyone echoed it, voices carrying across the lake like a promise. Later, when the crowd thinned and the stars came out, I walked to the far side of the property. The night air smelled of cedar and cold earth. In the distance, laughter still drifted from the porch. I closed my eyes and listened. There was no trace of bitterness left, no echo of the girl who once begged to be seen. Freedom, I realized, isn't just the absence of control, it's the presence of peace. I had built this house with my own hands, but the real foundation was the part of me they couldn't break, the will to begin again. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the cabin's windows, catching on the hand-carved sign Eli had hung while I slept. It read, "The House That Freedom Built." I ran my fingers over the letters, smooth and solid. They were words I'd once only dreamed of believing. For the first time, I didn't wake up thinking about what my family thought of me. I woke up thinking about what we'd build next, the next porch, the next bridge, the next dream that would start with rough boards and end with light. The bitterness that once kept me standing had turned into something sturdier, something I could finally rest on. The girl who left a dinner table in silence had become a woman who built a world out of it. And the world had met her halfway. Autumn came to Mirror Lake quietly. The pines deepened to darker green, and the air carried that sharp scent that means the year is folding itself down. Life at the cabin moved in slow rhythms now, coffee at dawn, sawdust by noon, laughter in the evenings when volunteers lingered too long. The Lake House Collective was thriving. We'd finished 3 restoration projects in nearby towns, and for the first time the work paid more than the bills. Freedom, I learned, could be sustainable when you stopped needing permission for it. Then one morning, a small envelope appeared in the mailbox, nailed to the gate. Cream-colored, no return address, my name written in my father's careful handwriting. I turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a folded letter and a photo of our old house, the front porch sagging, a for sale sign staked in the yard. My chest tightened. The letter was short, shaky. We loved you in the wrong way. Through fear, through comparison. We're starting over. And for the first time, we are proud of you. I stood there in the cool wind for a long time, reading the words again, not trusting them yet, not wanting to tear them apart either. My first instinct was to laugh, my second to cry, and my third finally to feel nothing at all. I walked down to the lake, letter still in my hand, and watched the water ripple around a single fallen leaf. They were selling the house that built our silence. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to explain. I'd already spoken the only truth that mattered the day I told them I didn't need their approval to exist. Still, a small part of me, maybe the 12-year-old girl who built bridges out of straws and waited for them to notice, felt something like mourning. Not for the people they were, but for the family that could have been. That afternoon, I went to the edge of the clearing where the forest met the open sky. The soil was soft from rain, dark and forgiving. I'd been saving a redwood sapling Eli found on a trip to the coast, its roots wrapped in burlap. He joined me without asking why. Together we dug a hole beside the porch, the scent of earth thick in the air. When it was ready, I set the small tree into the ground, covering its roots with my bare hands. "For new beginnings," I whispered. Eli handed me the watering can, his hand brushing mine. "For roots that grow where they're wanted," he said. As the water soaked through the soil, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The check on the table, the dinner I walked away from, the silence that used to burn. Each moment had been a cut, and yet somehow those cuts became the grain of my foundation. The wind lifted through the pines, carrying the smell of rain and cedar, and I felt my grandmother close again. Maybe this was what she meant when she said peace isn't quiet, it's knowing which noise to let go of. Later that evening, Eli brought out the small walnut box he'd carved months before. Inside, nestled in velvet, was my wooden ring, the one I'd started wearing not just as a promise, but as a reminder of what we'd built together. He set it beside the letter on the porch railing. "You ever going to frame that?" he asked, nodding at the paper. I shook my head. "No, I think it belongs to the past now. I just needed to see that they could learn how to say sorry, even if it's too late to start over." He nodded, understanding in his quiet way. We stood together, watching the last light slip through the trees, turning everything gold. In that stillness, I realized I'd stopped waiting for closure. What I had instead was continuation, the kind that doesn't need anyone's permission to keep moving. When the stars came out, I wrote one final line in my journal, the same one I'd kept since the night I left their house. They gave him money. They gave me silence. But silence became my foundation. I paused, then added, "Sometimes revenge isn't about making them pay, it's about letting them see you happy without needing their approval." The next morning, the sun broke over the lake, pouring through the cabin windows in bands of honey-colored light. I could see the new sapling from my desk, its leaves trembling in the breeze. It looked fragile but determined. I smiled because I knew it would outlive us all. It would stand through storms and seasons, roots deep in soil that once held pain but now held purpose. A knock came at the door, one of the new volunteers, a young woman named Tara who'd driven from Boise after reading the article. She wanted to learn carpentry to start over after walking out of her own toxic home. "You think I can really build something?" she asked. I handed her a pair of gloves. You already started, I said. By noon, the cabin was alive again with the sound of hammers, drills, laughter. I worked beside Tara, showing her how to square the corners of a frame the same way I'd once taught myself. Each strike of the hammer echoed like punctuation in a story that kept writing itself long after the pain had ended. As dusk fell, I sat on the porch with Eli watching the saplings sway under the rising moon. The lake shimmered silver, and the cabin glowed behind us, warm light spilling through its handmade windows. He leaned closer, his voice low. "If you could go back," he asked, "would you change anything?" I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "If I hadn't lost everything I thought I needed, I never would have built the life I actually wanted." He smiled. "Then I guess we're right where we're supposed to be." The night settled around us, calm and certain. The tree rustled softly, the sound like a heartbeat under the stars. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush across my face, carrying the faint scent of rain and new wood. For the first time, I understood what freedom really meant, not escape, but arrival. If anyone were listening, I'd tell them this: you can build peace from the ruins they left. You can turn every word that tried to break you into the blueprint for something stronger. You can walk away without hating, rebuild without begging, and still come out whole. The wind moved through the trees again, bending but never breaking them. It sounded almost like an answer. As Beatrice's story settles like dust after a long storm, we're left with the echo of what she built: strength, peace, and a life untouched by their approval. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more stories of betrayal, resilience, and quiet revenge. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one of them, and your voices shape what comes next. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.